Good morning. My name is Ruth Greenspan Bell, and I'm a public policy scholar. I have the privilege of being a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. For those of you who don't know the Wilson Center, which is a rare person, we are a think tank that was a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was, as I understand it, the only American president with a PhD, and came to the presidency from heading a major university. And it's huge fun to be here because scholars are working on every conceivable subject matter, and I get to listen to them. I have to ration my time so I get my work done and also listen to all the interesting stuff that's going on here. Our subject today is Canada and Kyoto. Everybody knows that Canada pulled out. I think we're going to talk about some of the reasons why, but I think this really gets us to a much bigger set of issues, which is what is the future of these multinational, multilateral agreements in trying to make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. And how do we get to that point where we can comfortably say we're making some progress on this issue? And I personally think that the Canadian action is just, it unfortunately demonstrates that once having signed one of these agreements, it does not necessarily mean you get to the result that you need to get to. And so a considerable additional thought needs to be given to, how do you actually achieve the substantive goals of those agreements, whether people are signing up or not signing up, and has things changed. So I'm really looking forward to a very rich and interesting discussion today, and what I'm going to do is introduce all three panelists at once, and then in the order in which they will speak. And you'll be able to see how we will move from the Canada-specific to the broader set of issues. So we're going to start with David McLaughlin, who's, by the way, the bios are there on papers, so all I'm trying to do is remind you what a fabulous, terrific, knowledgeable panel we have by just skipping through the highlights of those bios. He is the president and CEO of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. David has worked at the provincial and federal level in Canadian government on health, social, and fiscal issues. He also has extensive private sector experience. We're really pleased he is here today to share his deep understanding of the policy process in Canada. With roots in the only province in the Federation that is constitutionally bilingual, as I understand it, he probably, is that true?
Absolutely.
Yeah. He probably read with great satisfaction Sunday's New York Times op-ed, sharing research that people who are raised bilingual tend to be better problem solvers and smarter. So
I can leave now if you like, Ruth.
I loved it because my granddaughter is being raised bilingual Spanish, English, so I thought that was really a wonderful column. Peter Stute is next, and he's currently one of my colleagues here at the Wilson Center as the Fulbright Canada Wilson Center Chair. In his regular life, he also teaches international law, international relations theory, Canadian foreign policy, and human security, and he writes prolifically. His base is Concordia University in Montreal, and here at Wilson Center, he's working on a text to be titled Global Biosecurity, the International Politics of Denial, Fear, and Injustice. He also teaches global environmental governance at the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. And Andrew Light directs international climate policy at the Center for American Progress and also directs a Center for Global Ethics at George Mason University, where he teaches. He leads CAP's work on bilateral and multilateral climate and energy agreements, and most recently is focusing very heavily on international climate finance. We all know CAP's highly influential role in policy circles in Washington, D.C., I guess as long as the Democrats are in office. He has a very long list of publications, so I'm going to turn it over to our panelists.
So I'm first, I guess. Thank you very much for that, Ruth, and thank you, David, for the invitation to join you here at the Wilson Center. If you see me sweating, it's because of the lights. It's not the subject matter, although we'll see how the panel goes. It's a very simple situation, Canada in, Canada out. What I'm going to do is complicate it a bit for you in order to get in underneath it a bit and see if we can have a little better comprehension about how this happened and where Canada is on the climate and emissions file. And the way I'm going to do that is show you some numbers. I'm going to show you what the politicians said in their own words. I'm going to take you through a bit of a timeline. I'm going to sort of do a segue back into Canada-U.S. issues because that's important, and then a couple of conclusionary slides, and we'll see where we are from that. Okay, so I'm going to actually sit here and do this because it may be a little easier to go through. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Just I work at the National Roundtable. I have to do a slide to do my commercial on it, but it also will explain who we are and why we do things and why I can say some things versus others in the government, if you will. I'm going to talk about Canada-Kyoto, obviously the Canada-U.S. energy relationship, and then getting to 2020, because that's the target, that's the time frame, and we'll see how we're doing. So the National Roundtable, just the one slide on that. We were created in 1988 in the throes of the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future. We have a statute, we have a basis, a legal basis for existence, if you will, passed by Parliament in 1993. We're the only national public policy body mandated to study the environment and the economy together. So there's a lot of roundtables, the idea of you bring folks together around the environment and the economy. We're the last man standing, if you will, in the public policy field in Canada. We're arm's length from government. Some days more arm's length than others, which is fine, which gives us a bit of an independent voice. We give policy advice, and that's our job, and that's our privilege, and it's the job and the privilege of the Government of Canada to decide whether or not to accept that. And that's the way it works. It's an appropriate governance relationship. And so we're a catalyst, a convener, and agent provocateur, if I could say en français, if you will. So you can decide that for yourselves. Okay, Canada and Kyoto. Well, read the words, if you like. Prime Minister Chrétien, in 2001, 2005, and take you through a couple of periods, because there were distinct sort of post-signing periods where Canada has said certain things. So the Prime Minister Chrétien at the time, certainly extolling the virtues of Kyoto, and I think that was the sort of the general perception and general sense at the moment. Minister Anderson was the Environment Minister. And you see him saying in 2001, at the same time as the Prime Minister saying this is a great thing, we'll be analyzing the sectors where there's increases occur, meaning emission increases, and targeting emissions, actions to get there. So right away there's, some challenges on that. He's then also going to say that after looking at some emissions growth, some numbers that were presented at the time, the economy's growing. So we have to do something about it. We are, in a sense, the victims of our own success. Right away, economy versus environment. How do we sort of move those things together? So it was early on that, in fact, the challenge of Canada's emissions and growth versus the Kyoto construct and what Canada was trying to do and said we would do at the time. Advance forward now, we have a new government. The Conservatives come into office in 2006 and early 2006, and you begin to see a bit of a shift, obviously, in the tone and the approach on it. So Minister Baird, the Environment Minister in 2007, saying, at the time, we've been very clear, no intention of withdrawing from the UN framework, the Kyoto Protocol. And I think that was the view of the government at the time. I was involved, I was in the government in a different role, and certainly no sense I had that government comes in and said, okay, we're going to withdraw from that. But there was some skepticism about where Canada was and whether Canada could achieve these targets. And then it got formalized in 2008, and see here the speech from the throne, just a quick excerpt from it. But that's the formal speech statement of the government that opens the Parliament, and you can see here, basically saying, look, we're 33% above the Kyoto commitment, and we're not going to make it. And that was a reality check, and the reality, and a statement of reality, if you will. So that's 2008, and 2011, of course, we start to see the movement away, and Canada formally withdrawing. But this was being signaled in some respects because Canada wasn't going to make achieve its emission reduction targets. I'm not going to go through all of this slide here, but this starts to show the economic kind of conversation, economic, I guess, argument. And at the same time as the government moved in a different plan with what's called turning the corner, at the time Minister Baird as Environment Minister, the government released an economic assessment report showing, okay, if we achieved Kyoto, if we went just for Kyoto to achieve those targets, look at these kinds of economic impacts. And again, I won't go through them there, but you will be able to see, and you can have a copy of the presentation. There are some big impacts. So the economic argument was fairly front and center, and it's accurate. I mean, if Canada, having not made the kinds of emission reductions, country not having been able to do that, and then all of a sudden you hit a very hard target very fast, well, you're going to have an economic impact. So that also is a reality check. And then you start to see a bit of the shift again in terms of tone, and there's some, I'll say, skepticism where the world was going on it. So Minister Prentice, as Environment Minister, saying here, look, if you're going to have an international protocol reduces emissions, it has to apply to people who produce carbon. So you got to bring in the U.S. You have to bring in other emitters. So, and one of the questions about Kyoto that started to come up more and more in Canada was the distinction Annex 1, Annex 2. And all the rest of it. So this is, in fact, one level is accurate. If you want to reduce global emissions, everybody who emits has to be part of the solution. And then you start to see, then finally, Minister Kent, in this quote here, saying, gave ourselves an early Christmas present. We've exercised our legal right to get out of Kyoto, which for all of its deficiencies did not work for Canada. Our position has long been clear. We support a new international agreement that includes all major emitters. That's why for Canada, Kyoto Protocol is not where the solution lies. This agreement covers fewer than 30% of global emissions. And then this other part, which is also interesting, nor does it provide for individual countries to take action that reflects national circumstances. So not everybody's in. It's not going to be adequate on the roll, but also countries are different. And I'm going to talk a bit about Canada's distinctions and difference there. So, but you can see the trend. And what, in fact, happened is this a shift in targets. And so just to put up there as a reference point, you see the changes in targets for Canada from Kyoto. The first one is, you see the 2002, and then 2007, the turning the corner target, and then 2010 coming into out of Copenhagen, where Canada's aligned emission reduction targets with the U.S. So as you see a shift in the rhetoric, you also see a change in the rhetoric. You also see changes in emission targets, which are the basis for policy actions. Well, this is a graphic put together to just show the whole thing. So I probably could have dispensed with all of those quotes, but I wanted to put all the politicians back on the record. And you can see what's happened to emissions over time as things have happened as well. And you can, I won't go through it all, but turning the corners in there, federal action plan by the previous Liberal government. In other words, everybody has struggled a bit, and everybody has worked to try to put policy in place in order to meet some kind of commitments. First Kyoto, and then other national plans, and you can see the emission patterns here. There was a dip, obviously, as the recession hit, and economic output goes down. And there's some other issues, different weather patterns and happening, and then you start to see it rising again, emissions rising again, and then there's some projections there, which is some new stuff that the Roundtable has done. I'll show you a bit more. Okay, and then you can see the target. So, timeline, changes in policy, and changes in emissions. The Roundtable's, one of its jobs is to, every year we have to assess the government's action plan on Kyoto. Wait a minute. They didn't like Kyoto, they pulled out of Kyoto. Why is there an action plan on Kyoto? Well, minority parliaments are very funny things. And in the minority parliament, the first minority parliament, that the Conservatives were the government, the opposition, which by definition holds the majority, passed a bill called C-288, called the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act, which insisted that the government of the day, in that case the Conservative government, meet its Kyoto targets. And so that whole dynamic got in there. So it was a very significant political debate. One of the things that the Roundtable has to do is assess whether the government has done so. That's where the arm's length thing comes in. Remember that? So the government puts out an action plan saying this is what we're doing on Kyoto, and by the way, says we're not going to meet Kyoto. And we have to assess that, and we say, yes, by the way, we're not going to meet Kyoto. So we do the dance, everybody, but we put some numbers out, and here you can just see what was happening to emissions and what was going on in the Kyoto period, which of course is 2012, under various scenarios. And I'm just showing different emission paths because while they're going up, they dip down a little bit as some actions come in, changes in the economy, and then you start to see, whatever the numbers are, you start to see the pattern going back up again. And I'll show you a bit more of that. Canada and Kyoto. Well, Canada and the U.S. You can't talk about climate, you can't talk about emissions in Canada without understanding a bit more about the Canada-U.S. Energy relationship. And so just a few slides on that. First of all, we don't think alike. Canadians and Americans. So just a little, we do on many things, but not on everything. And so this one slide just shows differences in public opinion. It's a year old, so it's a bit, bit dated because public opinion is changing, especially in election years. And we've had one, and you've had one, or in the midst of one. But it does show that Canadians have believe in this research that climate change, global warming is real, and that action should be taken relative to Americans on the file. And it also shows in terms of who should be doing it, with more focus by Canadians saying, well, governments have a role. So even while governments may be skeptical about how far and how fast they can go, there's still a strong public opinion appetite for action, doing things, which is a good thing because it keeps, democracy keeps government's feet to the fire, and you actually get some things done. So that's the difference in public opinion. But if the U.S. isn't moving, then of course it has an impact on Canada. Well, we're a big energy supplier, and all this slide shows is, oh my, we are a very big energy supplier, and we export a lot of oil to the United States, and that's important. You need it. We need to sell it to you. And what does it really mean? Well, just take a look at these two bullets. Canada-U.S. Energy trade, which is more than just oil, obviously. 97% of our exports went to the U.S. Big customer, only major customer, obviously. Hence the China thing, which I won't get into, although you may want to chat about it. But just look at this, these numbers in red, looking ahead. This is big money for governments. You can't fund programs, you can't fund other social programs or whatever without having, obviously, economic wealth to generate it. And the energy construct, oil and other energy exports are a big generator of wealth, but tax receipts, et cetera, for governments. And they are, in the case of Alberta, oil sands and oil and gas royalties and rents and tax is the single biggest contributor to the provincial revenues. When you look at Canada and the U.S., say, well, okay, we have the same targets, you're moving, or we're not moving, or you're not moving, and we're moving. We have same targets, but we have different energy mixes, and so this complicates our life in terms of what we may do. You have a lot of coal, we have a lot of hydro. In fact, in many ways, Canada is more clean in terms of its energy production, electricity production, than people, or more precisely, electricity production than people think because of the hydro. We're over 75% in that sense. But when you start to align targets and align policies or looking at these impacts, you have different energy production, which creates a particular dilemma. And this is the dilemma. Let's have the same targets, which we do. Harmonizing on price and targets have different implications for Canada and the U.S. And the reason I'm going through this is because the competitiveness dilemma, if you will, because of the integrated economy, particularly for us, is really important in determining how fast or how far Canada can go, and is a big issue in determining a big influence in terms of how Canada was moving on Kyoto. So we harmonize on targets with the United States, as we do. Well, you can see the price per ton. This is modeling that the Roundtable has done, about a year and a half, 2 years old, I guess I'd say now, and we pay more. Why? Because of that previous slide I showed you. We're clean. We're more clean. So to get to that extra bit, it costs us more in terms of abatement. So that's when we align on targets. If we align on price, say, well, we're worried about competitiveness, let's have the same price, we get less emission reductions than in the U.S. So this is a particular dilemma for Canada. It's in its uniqueness, if you will, because we have this incredibly integrated economic and energy relationship that has a singular impact on how far and how fast we can go in terms of emission reduction, but the price for doing that. And if you want to talk about targets are one thing, price is another. And stringency of targets is again one thing, but the stringency of price, it will cost Canada more on a per ton basis to do abatement than many, many other countries, all of which are meeting Kyoto targets. Now, how about that? So again, the dilemma of having a target, but being able to pay to afford it. And there you see the two things together. So getting to 2020. Well, we have these emission reduction targets. Canada is, as Ruth mentioned, talked about just quickly, we're a federation, as are you, and we have everybody playing in the game. So there's a Canada target set by the federal government on behalf of the country, but provinces are doing their own things too. And so you look on the left here, you see all of the targets of the various governments, and it starts to raise a question. So our 2020 target, 17% below 2005, is 607 megatons. And so if you add up all these targets, you get some different dynamics. So if you take all the provincial emission targets, for example, supposedly that would get us down to 648 megatons. So that's just a gap. So whose job is it to get the rest of the way? And in a federation, you know, it's everybody's job, no one's job, and this is part of the dilemma in terms of how Canada is moving or not. So just keep that question in mind. Well, how are we doing again? Oh, you know, one more time, let's looking at emissions. Now, this is an Environment Canada chart that I've reproduced here, and it shows the business as usual line, and you see this red line going up with no government actions. That's the emissions trend if governments weren't doing anything. Well, governments are doing things, and so you start to see the line bending down a bit, and that's the blue line, and that's about 25% of the way there, and you see where we would be projected in 2020. Bearing in mind that all forecasts are wrong before they even hit the PowerPoint slides, as you know. But you see the gap. So how are we going to close the gap? That's getting to 2020, and that's what I want to talk about here. You need to know a bit about where emissions come from. So this just shows that, you know, because our emissions profile, about half comes from stationary combustion sources, and it's just, you can see the range of things there. There's no one place. You've got to go after a lot of sources, not unlike any other countries, but every country is different. So it's going to have different policies, different actions to achieve the results. And Canada, again, being a federation, everybody contributes to emissions, and ideally everybody contributes to emission reductions. And this just shows the range of emissions coming by provinces, and you'll see Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec as big emission producers. So you're going to have to get those provinces involved, and natural resources are owned by the provinces. They determine the rate of exploitation, et cetera. On a per capita basis, you sort of equalize, it gets complicated again. Get Saskatchewan in the mix, Alberta in the mix. My home province of New Brunswick, small province, 750,000 people. On a per capita basis, big emitter. What are you doing about it, New Brunswick? This is the dilemma of how you got to get to any target, whether it's Kyoto or not. So what's the federal government doing? Well, you can just see these bullets just start to set out. We're all emitters in. We're looking for a federal government position, a binding global agreement, a U.S. alignment focus, not exclusively, clean energy dialogue, that sort of stuff, a regulatory sector-by-sector approach. So we'll regulate emission reductions from key sectors as opposed to, say, market-based instruments across the board, performance standards, these kinds of things. And FPT, Federal, Provincial, Territorial, that's the acronym we use, an aggregate contribution. Everybody contributes. And you can see a quote by Peter Kent. So that's generally the federal approach. Provinces are doing a lot of things as well, and this slide and the next slide just gives you a flavor of the range of things that they're doing. They have action plans, energy plans, targets, renewable resource development. There's a sustainability plan. There's a whole number of things that are common across, but they also have individual pieces, and you can see which provinces are doing, in the bottom part, different kinds of things. Alberta investing a bit more in carbon capture and storage. You'll see clean electricity, clean coal stuff by a range of provinces, particularly Ontario. So there's no one policy. There's no one action. There's a range of things. It starts to get complicated. And then you see, again, a whole list of other things. So a whole bunch of stuff going on in terms of getting emission reductions in Canada that's under the surface in some respects, but it's not one action. You can't point to one thing, and that's the nature of it. It's a federation, and it's a big country with different emission sources, as you know, so you can see the list there. Well, let's go back to this, and we see what's happening in terms of emission trends. They're going up. What's driving them? This is looking ahead to 2020, and you'll see oil and gas as a big driver of emissions. So you start to see where at one level the problem lies. And oil and gas, of course, is in Alberta, one key province, a bit in Saskatchewan, a bit in BC, mostly. So we've been asked to do some work at the Roundtable to look at how we get there. The Minister of Environment formally has asked the Roundtable to look at provincial plans and see how we could get to our 2020 target to inform the federal government's approach. So this is formal, official work that we are doing for the government. These are the questions that were asked to us. How do we get there, and can we get there? We've modeled a bunch of policies, just a few slides to sort of finish this off, just to show you where we've done a fairly detailed assessment, and I'm going to share a bit of that with you. But these are again, I showed you those range of policies. Well, now we've had to put them together to figure out where they go. And this just shows you what we've modeled by jurisdiction. We've engaged a lot with provinces, looking at their numbers, for federal numbers, et cetera. So, emissions with no policy after 2005, and you can see just out to 2020, and the blue line at the bottom is the target. So that's sort of the emission trend. Our preliminary work, when you start to put all this together, we start to get a little bit more. So this is with stuff on the books. In fact, a little better than what's already out there. So Canada, in fact, is making some progress. And these projections, they carry forward, and we're testing them, refining them. They'll change a bit, I think, as we talk with provinces and just to validate a bit. But we're making a bit more progress than people first thought. So we still doesn't close the gap fully, but it gets us more of the way to closing the gap than was first there. So did Canada leave Kyoto because it didn't work for Canada, because it didn't work for the world, because targets couldn't be met, because no plans were in place, because economic impacts were too great? So you check your answer. I'm going to let you decide that, and we'll let the panel kind of work that. But those are the kinds of things that start to come into play. And it's just worth reminding all of us, it's a question of these kinds of things. It is our energy economy, and we're a big producer, energy producer, integrated relationship. It's our political economy. Where do emissions come from? We're a federation. They have to respect the nature of the federation and how we do it. It gets complicated. Our political consensus and our societal consensus, which, if you saw, that's why I showed you some of those political statements by politicians in the past. You saw how that consensus wasn't fully there. And those jurisdictions which have made progress, and particularly in Europe and that, there isn't that kind of question about a political societal consensus. So the Kyoto debate got off, in many respects, to a bad start in Canada. Early on, the same government that signed on said, we're going to have trouble meeting the targets. Here's how we get there. And I think that's had an impact as to how we've gone forward. So that's just to set the stage, provide some information for you, and happy to take some questions later on. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, the floor is yours.
Sorry, here, Peter.
Oh, thank you. If we can get this over here. Okay, well, I apologize for my voice. I'm a bit, no pun intended, under the weather, as we say. Thank you, David. It's I think many Canadians are either unknowledgeable or underappreciative of how objective and solid the work of the National Roundtable is. And so it's a real pleasure to have you here today and hear from you. And I was able to come away with some optimism from what you said. What I'd like to argue, however, is that it's not just about emissions. To some degree, what's happening today already is that climate change is occurring. We're seeing the impact on various communities. We're seeing it around the world. And it has become, I think, the modern-day equivalent of the North-South debates which occurred in the 1970s and 1980s. And this is profound. This is going to help, I think, and I know that the next speaker is more knowledgeable on me than this regarding international negotiations, but I think it will have a profound impact and permeate every aspect of future climate change negotiations. So Keystone politics aside, Canadians, potential citizens of the next great energy superpower, need to have a more elaborate and enriching debate on climate change adaptation. In other words, in responding to climate change, not just in terms of energy efficiency, reducing emissions, carbon sequestration, and all the rest of that, but actually adjusting to the changes that are taking place. And this takes place at home, of course, and particularly in the north, where we have permafrost thawing, where we have ice cover, which is no longer reliable for hunting, for subsistence. The Washington, D.C. Film Festival is on now. I don't know if people know that. It's fantastic. It's free for the most part. I've been to a few films already, probably where I caught this cold, but anyway. But what I'm struck by is most of the films now that show contemporary situations are actually showing the present impact of climate change on communities. And their struggle, their survival paths, if you wish, are being altered. And of course, as climate justice and environmental justice would suggest, this typically occurs to the people that are most vulnerable and the people that have least recourse to resources to help them. Now, the lack of leadership at the federal level on Kyoto-related energy efficiency, emissions mitigation, and there are very good reasons for this, as was explained. It's partially offset, I think, and here's the optimism, by actions at the provincial and municipal levels, and other people have commented on this extensively. And this happens at a para-state level where states are dealing with provinces, etc., or vice versa. It also happens at a transnational level, I think, where you've got cooperation between firms across the border, particularly in the Canadian-American case. But I think we have to face the fact, and let's give the Conservatives credit for their policy honesty on the issue here. We were nowhere near reaching our Kyoto goals. And climate change is occurring today, not in some dystopian, distant future. Countries with high end per capita emissions bear a differentiated responsibility for the situation. And I won't expand on this at length because we have a foremost expert here, Dr. Light, on environmental ethics and these questions. But the climate change adaptation, on the other hand, I would argue, can't be done at the local level. Right? It has to be implemented at the local level, obviously, but it can't be funded that way. This is something the federal government is going to actually have to get involved in. And it's going to have to get involved not just domestically, and in particular dealing with the peoples in the north, and people that live in shorelines around the Great Lakes and so forth, but it's also going to have to look at its international commitments. And this carries on a longer tradition, of course, of American and Canadian international development assistance, which is slowly, I won't use the phrase being taken over, but it's certainly getting to know very well the climate change adaptation scenarios. So I think this change is very important. And I've just given this is PowerPoint minus 101 here, as my wife would call it. Threw it together the other night. But a moderate predictive scenario suggests that the regional impacts of climate change will be very expensive. Projected needs for the Global Green Climate Fund, and this emerges out of recent talks. The hope there is that we'll come up with $100 billion a year. Now, that's not just for adaptation, that's for other things as well. But nonetheless, it gives you an idea of the sort of price tag we are looking at eventually if emissions are not reduced substantially, and they're not going to be. So let's live with that fact and talk about adaptation in the process is, I guess, the brunt of my argument. Coastal flooding, shoreline erosion, glacier retreat, chronic water shortages, loss of biodiversity and habitat, spread of invasive alien species, extreme weather events. I could go on and on. Taking preventive action against these will be expensive enough. Taking responsive action to events is even more expensive, as anyone in the insurance industry will tell you. Many mitigation and adaptation strategies blend together as hybrids today, and building more effective energy systems can be seen as both an attempt to prevent and respond to climate change. So this presents a bit of an accounting nightmare when it comes to determining where exactly we're putting our money. I'll come back to that. Adaptation has perhaps controversially supplanted other terms, such as gender and human security, in the International Development Assistance Funding application lexicon. I've certainly noticed that. I do a bit of work in biodiversity and conservation areas. And most of the applications that are coming in now, whereas 10 years ago would be sure to mention gender or another issue such as that, climate change adaptation is becoming the sort of standard now. Now, we can debate that, whether that's a good or a bad thing. It's somewhat problematic, I think, especially for people that have been engaged in development assistance for many years. The ground's sort of shifting under them, and it changes, if you wish, the constellation of experts which are being consulted on these issues. Paying for adaptation is not going to be easy, though. It's going to be painful. We already have I'll use a phrase we used in a talk yesterday. I see Liz back there. A risk-averse, I guess, government when it comes to taxes, right? And that's commendable in many ways. But I think that the price tag that could be attached to adaptation will cause serious problems in the future. And I hope that the Roundtable looks at this issue as well in terms of its economic costs and opportunity costs and so forth. There's a lot of precedent, of course, internationally for dealing with this. There's a global environmental governance architecture. It's weak overall, but it's vibrant in some spaces. It reflects a general acknowledgement that global environmental justice must at least be on the table as an organizing principle. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification, for example, is very explicit about this. This is about North-South still, and it's about trying to help achieve sustainable development in Africa, particularly, that avoids further land degradation. I see no reason why the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar north, for example, through the Arctic Council or some other mechanism, should be denied such a claim. The impact of climate change arguably might be even more deleterious on their communities, although that's debatable, of course. And we have authors such as Randall Hansen, refer to the, I quote, ethnocide via climate change of Arctic indigenous communities. We have the small island states and their alliance, which has taken legal redress and tried to charge willful ignorance, or at worst, purposeful negligence on the part of the North when it comes to their own long-term survival. And of course, for them, climate change adaptation might mean actually moving away from their homelands, which will be under seawater. The stress on agricultural production will be monumental, and so forth. I'm going to come to this because Canada has basically made a commitment, which was touted at some length at Durban and elsewhere, on this issue. But there are other international precedents as well. The Montreal Protocol to the Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer explicitly acknowledges that there should be some sort of transfer of wealth and resources from north to south to help to deal with this issue. The Clean Development Mechanism, RED+, many of you have heard of these things. I mean, there's some element there, all right? It's debatable how far they go as market mechanisms and so on. But they're all to some degree recognition that even market-based approaches must involve some form of compensation for the opportunity costs of curtailing development, classically defined, even if charges of carbon colonialism are now gaining some strength in the climate change voice. A recent Parliamentarians for Climate Justice meeting in Bangladesh, which involved several Canadian elected representatives, by the way, although I don't think any of our majority party, demanded more focus on the issue. And older students of international relations may be affected by a bit of a nauseating sense of deja vu here. Oh no, here we go again, north-south. Yes, to some extent, unavoidable. On the other hand, there are some changes that have occurred, and I think we are heading towards, thankfully, longer-term negotiations which involve all the major polluters. That's extremely important. So we're slowly hammering out this structure, and I look forward to hearing more about that. Some hard choices will have to be made about where adaptation funding goes, who deserves it, and how it's actually distributed. And I think, and again, this could be expanded on, I think that at Durban at least, one thing that came out of there was a new sort of framework for that, if you wish, that satisfied some of the concerns that some of the leading states would have. The Canadian participation on this. You have to recall, prior to Durban, this was released. $1.2 billion will be given over the next 3 years on climate change initiatives, climate change initiatives, some of which are more attuned to adaptation efforts than others, right? And so I just took this right from their own webpage. There actually is an Action on Climate Change website, which is welcome. You know, we went for several years with basically nothing on the Canadian government website on climate change, which is a bit odd. There's an explicit recognition there that we have an obligation. There's an explicit recognition that as a per capita heavy polluter, Canada, and if we're looking at the kind of figures which were previously mentioned, and you know, $483 billion in royalty and tax revenues, depending on the specific projection of oil and gas development, surely it behooves us to share some of that with those that are disadvantaged by this, by climate change. So these are the sort of things they're looking at, though. Most of it's World Bank funding. Most of it, some of it's new, some of it's not, right? There was some statements that it was all new. It's not all new. It's not true. But a lot of it is, that's for sure. But much of it goes to the IFC, right, which, as you might know, gives out loans. There is a project within that which deals with climate resilience, which is sort of where we're getting at. Some of it goes to, as you'll see here, so this is all mostly just World Bank stuff. At the bottom, $10 million to the IDRC. IDRC is a great think tank when it comes to international development issues. But we can argue that 10 million is not much, and we can also argue that this is basically supporting a Canadian think tank rather than redistributing wealth of any sort. And you can see the rest of it here. Much of it, these are countries in which we're already engaged, countries in which CETA is already doing some work. Obviously, Ethiopia, Haiti, and Vietnam, 3 areas where, to some extent, we're also trying to build markets, particularly in the latter. The Alliance of Small Island States, it's wonderful we sponsored a conference, but I guess one might argue we should get a bit more serious about that. The GEF, I think, does wonderful work overall. Many aspects of international environmental governance, many organizations are really reliant on the GEF for funding, and we shouldn't overlook the importance of that. I think Canada's contribution there is vital, and I'm pleased to see that it might increase. The only problem I have with it is that I'm not clear on just how earmarked this funding is for adaptation efforts themselves, which really need the focus. You know, you need to build better shorelines. Right? You need to take efforts to protect biodiversity, if possible, from encroaching environmental change and things like this. I'm not too sure how much of that is actually there as a prerequisite for that kind of spending. $1.2 billion over 3 years is actually quite paltry, given the size of the problem, given the fact that most estimates say Canada spends about $1.5 billion per year in subsidies for oil and gas alone. The IEA estimates that current global subsidies are well over $400 billion a year for gas and oil. Secondly, many of these investments are already part of overseas development assistance, so they get scored twice as goodwill gestures. This is double dipping in accountancy, if you wish, in feel-good accountancy. And it will be an increasingly common and contested feature, I think, of the future ODA landscape, both in Canada and elsewhere, raising issues about where one begins, where climate change adaptation begins, and international development assistance ends. That being said, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I hope we can take it further. I'd also like to see perhaps, however, a bit more transparency on the website. These are figures for 2010 that I've just given you. So where are we going from there? I'd like to see, I think by mid-March 2012, we should at least have figures for 2011 on the website and some indication of where this $1.2 billion is going. Someone joked the other day that Environment Minister Kent made quite a bit of brouhaha about the $1.2 billion in the eve of Canada's pulling out of Kyoto, to the point where some people call him the $1.2 billion man, because he would mention this again and again. Well, where is it going more specifically? And perhaps that information is available. It's not on the website. I haven't been in Ottawa recently, and I hope to try and find out when I get there. Just to conclude, we need an dialogue is needed on this ethical imperative. It just doesn't come up, I think, much in the Canadian media. It hasn't yet, and I'd rather it come up now than it hit us hard in a few years. It's vital we have a dialogue on this. It will not go away. There's an ethical imperative to at least make a contribution to such funding. It's not just about money, at least not directly. Canadian technical, policy, and financial expertise should be harnessed for this purpose as well, and we really have it. We're really developing it. Universities are working hard on these issues. Let's use it. Unlike in other policy areas, there's no way to unload or pass the buck on climate change adaptation efforts. They demand the utilization of centralized resources, redistributed throughout the country and through multilateral funding mechanisms, private-public partnerships, and so forth. I'm certainly not suggesting adaptation funding should supplant more traditional emergency humanitarian or even environmental funding. It should be seen as a supplement, albeit one with increasing importance, but not as a new form of dependency or a gold rush of tide aid opportunities. I do, however, believe that the current government is quite right in its emphasis, which you can see throughout its work in these areas, on stressing accountability. This is going to be very important. Canadian taxpayers have the right to know exactly where this money is going, and when it hits the ground as well, and as it gets funneled through multilateral organizations. I would suggest, though, that we need to get in that light, we need to get the accounting and communications right on this. And this is the benefit, perhaps, of going with something like the Green Climate Fund, which apparently we're no longer interested in at the moment. Hopefully, Canada will join the UNFCCC process. It'll be a post-Kyoto process, and it will be one which includes the Climate Fund, however, and I think that would permit Canada to play a part in a multilateral effort that has established modes of accountability and a relatively long-term timeline. We need to do some future planning here. Not always the easiest thing to do in politics, I realize that, but if you don't try, you certainly will not succeed. To use a Canadian saying, one that Wayne Gretzky is so fond of, the only way to not score a goal is to not shoot, right? So thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So our third speaker is Andrew, and Andrew, go for it.
So thanks very much. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be invited by the Wilson Center, especially the Canada Institute, to speak. I want to thank David for inviting me. I never speak on a panel that's about Canada without pointing out that I owe a good deal of my current career to the federal government of Canada, who gave me a great 3-year postdoctoral fellowship, which I spent at the University of Alberta, working mostly on environmental risk assessment, mostly on tar sands oil, which has come back around. So I'm sort of finding that training to be particularly appropriate now. So I have a lot of affection for the opportunities that were given to me at that time, still today. So my sort of role, as David asked me when he invited me to be on the panel, was not to talk about to follow up and say my perspective on where Canada is and why Canada pulled out of Kyoto specifically, though I think that I certainly agree with a lot of the reasons that were offered so far, nor to talk about the U.S. position on climate change, but really to talk about the international arena and kind of where we're moving forward. So I'm going to put this in the context of the last UN Framework Convention climate talks in Durban, which just concluded last December. So as we approach Durban, let's talk about sort of where we were in terms of approaching Durban, and then I'm actually going to swing back to really focus on exactly the issues that Peter was highlighting in his talk, especially on climate finance, where, as Ruth said, I spend a lot of my time working now. And I do think that the climate finance agenda is the most important agenda on mitigation and adaptation for the rest of this decade. I think it's probably the only place, at least out of the Framework Convention process, where we actually see the possibility of closing the gap between the current ambition that the largest emitters around the world have and where we need to be by 2020 to have any of our long-term mitigation targets remotely possible. So going into Durban, as we all know, and this has been pointed out in David's remarks earlier, the Kyoto Protocol was certainly not going to be the agreement, even under the best scenarios, for getting the mitigation that we would need in order to achieve some degree of climate safety, which is sort of in the international political arena is effectively defined as stabilizing temperature increase caused by humans at 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. What did emerge, though, out of the 2009 Copenhagen meeting was which is effectively now referred to as the bottom-up alternative to the top-down that we saw with Kyoto, which was the attempt to try to create an opportunity and encourage parties to say unilaterally what they're willing to do in order to reduce emissions concurrent with the overall goal of holding temperature increase at 2 degrees Celsius. That goal was enshrined in the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, which wasn't, as most of you know, an official decision of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change because there were 5 parties that held out, that withheld their assent to that goal moving forward. But it was enshrined the following year in 2010 when the Framework Convention had its annual meeting in Cancun. So just to explain the next slide, which will give you sort of a breakdown of what all the parties collectively have said they're willing to do, let me give you, this is just the assumptions that will make these make sense. So what we have here, and this is modeling that we did with Project Catalyst, what we have here is the reference condition. This was the modeling assumptions that we set up in 2009 in the approach to the Copenhagen UN Framework Convention meeting. The BAU, and this is expressed not in terms of parts per million of atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, but in terms of absolute gigatons. So where we're headed by 2030 is 70 gigatons on a business as usual path. If we wanted to have any chance of stabilizing at 450 parts per million with some kind of cushion, with an overshoot, then by 2030 we'd want to go down to 35 gigatons annually by 2030. The bottom-up process, the reference year for the bottom-up process, and we saw this with David, is 2020. So that's the year that we want to sort of know. That's the only year that's in the international arena where parties have been compelled or volunteered to say how much reductions they're willing to make by some point in the future. There is the ambition that was expressed, I'll just say as an aside here, at the G8 meeting in Lechia, Italy in 2009, the summer before the Copenhagen meeting, where the G8 parties said that they thought that their global responsibility was an overall 80% reduction by 2050 of their emissions collectively. But in terms of what parties have put forward in terms of an international agreement, in the context of an international agreement, parties have only been compelled to say what they're willing to do by 2020. That was the agreement that everyone made at Copenhagen. So that's really the only thing we can effectively measure, right, in terms of promises, policy commitments that parties have made. So on our assumption, the analysis I'm about to show you, if we want, so this would be a way of measuring how close we are to where we ought to be in terms of the pathway we optimally want to be on, by 2020, in order to hit 35, we should at least have bent down our emissions from where we will be, or where we would have been in 2009 to 61 gigatons annually, by 2020 down to 44 gigatons annually. So that's a reduction of 17 gigatons. That's optimally what we want to see out of all the commitments that came out of Copenhagen. And if you go and the best single website is still to this day the Climate Action Network's Who's on Board with the Copenhagen Accord website. I love that name. So if you go to the Who's on Board with the Copenhagen Accord website, you can see that there's over 110, now about 124 parties who have said, have enshrined in the international architecture of the Framework Convention what they're willing to do, and they give very detailed commitments, depending on the country. In the case of developed countries parties, and the two that have been mentioned so far, Canada and the U.S. have the same target, a 17% reduction below 2005 levels by 2020. And then with developing countries, their submissions are more sectoral. So with Indonesia, you get, for example, how much they're willing to do in terms of energy efficiency, how much they're willing to do in the forestry sector, which is their biggest contribution overall, incidentally, to global emissions. Sector by sector. China, it's also sectoral. You know, they have an energy intensity target overall, but they also have a forestry target. India enshrines its 20 gigawatt solar target, for example, in its commitment. You add all of those things together, all of the pledges that are made by all parties, consistent with the goal of by 2020 being on the pathway to stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius, and you get this picture here, and I'll just sort of take a couple of minutes and walk you through this. So we're going to move from the left side, which is BAU, to where we need to be, remember, 44 gigatons annually of global emissions, and the assumption there is that's in order to get us on a 2 degrees Celsius pathway at 450 parts per million in terms of atmospheric concentrations, which gets you, according to most estimates, if you take the averages of, like, if you stabilize at 450 parts per million, how likely are you to stabilize at 2C at the end of the century? And it's about 50% chance, basically. It's a 50% chance of stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius. EPA ranks it higher. IPCC ranks it a bit lower. So we sort of, this is this slide I've been continuously updating every year since 2009. And already, actually, my BAU emissions have gotten better, and that's two things. One very good thing, and one very, not one very good thing and one thing that we probably wouldn't want to try to duplicate. The very good thing is that you'll see that BAU emissions have gone down from 61 to 56 out to 2020, partly because returns from investments in forestry programs from the 1990s were actually much better than were anticipated when we started this modeling exercise, so that's good news. The bad news is we all know why everyone's emissions dipped down in from 2009 and now was because of the global economic recession. So again, that's not your recipe for any political party around the world to continue encouraging emission reductions. But anyway, what it does mean is that we actually have now a shorter, compressed number. We only need to go down 12 gigatons annually from 56 down to 44 by 2020. And then you look at the pledges that were made by the Copenhagen, according to the Copenhagen Accord, and that's at that website, who's on board with the Copenhagen Accord, and all those over 100 parties and what they say they're willing to do. Now, the Copenhagen, we break down, as almost everyone else does, we break down the Copenhagen Accord pledges into two buckets, and the buckets are the unconditional pledges and the conditional pledges. And the unconditional pledges are what every party says they're willing to do with no conditions. It's stuff they will just do on their own. And you know, Ruth has been concerned for quite some time in some of her work about, like, parties make pledges, but how do you get them to actually enforce, you know, whatever domestically they ask to do? This is, I think, where we have I'm more confident in these low Copenhagen pledges because these are largely made out of self-interest. So totally they amount to 5.5 gigatons. That's from developed and developing countries. More reductions from developing countries because their emissions, of course, are growing faster than developed countries. A lot of this is motivated by, for example, the money they're going to save from efficiency measures, the energy security they're going to get from getting off of putting more renewables into their energy mix. And that gets us down to a 50.5 emissions expected by 2020 in the what's called the low Copenhagen scenarios. Now, in addition to that, many of the parties also made conditional pledges. In the case of developed countries, the conditional pledges were always articulated as a condition on some kind of political deal. So the European Union famously says they will reduce their emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020 by themselves, and then they will go to an additional reduction of 30% below 1990 levels by 2020 if other parties like Canada and the US and Australia, other major developed countries, also have some comparable effort. And now there's an active debate. There's been an active debate for a number of years in Europe whether or not they should just unilaterally go to 30%. But we put that additional 10% of reductions here in terms of what we call the high Copenhagen scenarios because they are conditional. The developing country conditional pledges are to a one always conditioned on money and some technology transfer. So again, we'll go back to Indonesia. Indonesia says they can squeeze a certain number of megatons out of their forestry sector by themselves with additional money, like the money they're getting from Norway, for example, now, like the money they're currently on track to get from the United States through the Millennium Challenge Corporation compact we signed last fall with them. then they are willing to squeeze more reductions out. So that's the next move. So what we get then is this picture here, which is actually not too bad a picture from the perspective of where we could be by 2020, which is that if all conditions are met, then the ambition of all the top emitters around the world and many of the smaller emitters is that we would be down to 48 gigatons annually of emissions by 2020, leaving this gap of an additional 4 gigatons to where we would optimally want to be by 2020 to continue on some kind of 2 degrees Celsius path. So again, the idea here is not that we hit 44 gigatons annually by 2020 and we've achieved everything we want. That would be statistically impossible, mathematically impossible. What it means is that if we're at 44 gigatons annually by 2020, then we're in the lane as long as additional emission reductions continue throughout 2030, 2040, 2050. By 2050, and if we had sort of met the high targets that have been set by some parties already, then we'll be in good shape to have that 50-50 shot of stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius. And so, in a lot of respects, and this is now in the parlance of the international community, this is the emissions gap. And as you'll see, the emissions gap, or the ambition gap, out to 2020 is actually 2 gaps. It's, first of all, the gap between the low pledges and the high pledges, and the gap between the cumulative pledges made in the Copenhagen Accord and enshrined in Cancun a year later, and where optimally we'd want to be by 2020. There are currently no pledges beyond 2020 that any country has enshrined in an international agreement. Again, there have been some statements of ambition in a few places, but there are no actual concrete pledges. And because of that, we need some other process to sort of think about where mitigation will be post 2020, and that really was what the parties were trying to achieve at the last UNFCCC meeting in Durban. So just keep that in mind in terms of where we'd want to be based on these are not bound in an international agreement like Kyoto. This is a pledge and review system. It's a pledge and review system with some backing. So the Copenhagen Accord and the Cancun agreements really did flesh out to a great degree a system of measurement, reporting, and verification for how you sort of track how well parties are doing in terms of are meeting the ambition they've articulated in terms of their pledges as part of this process. But again, it's not something like Kyoto where there was an enforcement mechanism. But that's the bottom-up process where we have now, and that's effectively where we were heading into Durban. So what happened in Durban? So the Durban meeting, and we just should probably save most of this for the Q&A, was an incredibly complicated meeting for a number of reasons. This at the Center for American Progress, this is what my stellar art team came up with, and we're trying to think of how do we sort of explain what happened in Durban if people follow this stuff carefully. So we came up with a bridge, a bridge metaphor. And the idea is that there are 3 pillars to the bridge that was built in Durban, 3 separate tracks of agreements that kind of happened. And the impetus for this, for those who followed it closely, you'll know a lot of this. The impetus for this is effectively why we got the outcome we got in Durban was because of the impending end of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was set to end in 2012. There was no parties were dropping off left and right. Canada was actually one of the later parties to drop out. Before Canada dropped out of the Kyoto Protocol, Japan dropped out. A year earlier, Russia dropped out. Other parties had dropped out, largely citing a lot of the same reasons that David said, which was, look, the Kyoto Protocol, even if everyone signed up, just doesn't have enough parties in it who are required to reduce their emissions because of the architecture of developed countries having legally binding emission reductions in the Kyoto Protocol and developed countries having legally binding emission reductions and developing countries having no legally binding emission reductions in the Kyoto Protocol. But nonetheless, the Kyoto Protocol, as we all know, had lots of other really important mechanisms in it that developing countries liked as well, especially things like the Clean Development Mechanism. And so if you don't know the full architecture of this, the Clean Development Mechanism is effectively a global offsetting mechanism. So parties that accept reductions under the Kyoto Protocol can reduce a portion of their emissions by paying for clean energy projects and other mitigation projects and some adaptation projects even abroad. And the the worry was that if the Kyoto Protocol died, if no party was willing to re-up the Kyoto Protocol, then the clean development mechanism and the other parts of the Kyoto architecture would also fall off. And so developing countries, almost to a one, were demanding going to the meeting that, yes, we have to re-up the Kyoto Protocol. The only party willing to do this was the European Union, who had already articulated a pledge in Copenhagen of their 20% reduction, which would have, was certainly sufficient, right, for whatever they would be required to do under Kyoto. So Europe was in the driving seat going to the Durban meeting. So if Europe said no to continuing the Kyoto Protocol, everything falls apart, including all the process we'd made on the Cancun agreements and the Copenhagen Accord and all that sort of bottom-up MRV structure, measurement, reporting, and verifying structure, the reduced emissions from deforestation, developing countries, the RED programs, like all that was sort of fallen apart if the meeting had effectively ground to a halt over whether or not the Kyoto Protocol was going to be continued. And so what the Europeans said is, we will continue the Kyoto Protocol on one condition, only if we can begin the process of creating a new treaty, which all parties will have to come into, which will have the same legal mandate for all parties, whether they're developed or developing countries. So they were sort of saying effectively, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, tear down that wall, right? Between developed and developing countries that had sort of been built up since the Kyoto Protocol, they wanted one kind of common treaty. And so, to the amazement of many, including myself, we got actually that agreement. And so just to walk you back here, the agreement was to create something called the Durban Platform, which has to be completed by 2015, though it will not enter into force. At the earliest, it will enter into force by 2020. And that will be, we hope, a new binding international treaty to replace all other treaties that will set common targets or something for all parties that will cover 100% of global emissions. Targets will be decided, as part of the Durban Platform, and I'll come back to this later perhaps, there is a commitment to look at this gap, right? The current gap between where we think we'll be by 2020 given the current policies that have been pledged by different parties around the world and where we need to be by 2020. And then to walk you back, because we got the Durban Platform, this process that now has started to create a new treaty, then the Cancun agreements, which was all that bottom-up stuff, that's gone forward. That's very good. And the most important thing out of the Cancun agreements, and to go back to Peter's presentation, is the creation of this new Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund, as it was originally articulated in the Copenhagen, will be this global fund which will raise the bulk of the commitment of raising $100 billion annually by 2020 for both mitigation and adaptation. But also all the architecture that tries to keep parties pledges, all the pledges they made unilaterally, keep them to that. And the Kyoto Protocol will continue as well, out for another 5 years, but only with the EU bound to reduce emissions, we presume, unless other parties this year decide that they want to jump on for some reason. But that effectively means, even if it's only the EU, that the clean development mechanism, the joint implementation mechanism, all these other sort of parts of Kyoto continue as well. So the problem then from this, from the point of view of reducing emissions internationally, is that you've got now a hoped-for new international agreement which will presumably have the same rules for developing and developed countries. And we can, if you want to, we can talk about some of the submissions that have come in as of the end of last month, if people are following this very closely, and sort of we can do sort of a gut check on what it looks like after a couple of months after Durban to whether parties are really serious about this in a second. But basically, at best, in terms of some kind of new legally binding architecture, nothing will happen out of this process for reducing emissions until after 2020. In terms of new architecture for something that's kind of like a legally binding architecture, because they're not going to finish the new treaty until 2015, and it's not going to go into force until at least 2020, and that was a stipulation that China and India insisted on. And so if we go back to this slide, remember the goal here from this analysis is we have this ambition that parties have said where they want to reduce emissions, how they're willing to reduce emissions by 2020. It is short of where we ought to be by 2020. So in terms of what are we going to do to get to this a reduction of 44 gigatons by 2020, the only thing left out of this process is, in fact, the Green Climate Fund. Because if you go back and look at this slide through a kind of a different lens, the difference between the conditional pledges made by all parties and the unconditional pledges largely is going to be finance. And where's the finance going to come from? Hopefully from something like the Green Climate Fund or the other sort of sources of international finance like the World Bank SIFs or something else. And in terms of where we would get from the combined Copenhagen pledges, conditional and unconditional, to where we optimally need to be, how do we squeeze off this last 4 gigatons? The only thing that I think that will encourage parties to increase their ambition further, again, is going to be climate finance. And that is why climate finance is, I think, in the Framework Convention. Now, we can talk later about non-Framework Convention opportunities for mitigation. In terms of the Framework Convention, the Green Climate Fund and other finance mechanisms, that is, right, the name of the game in order to get to this optimal path. Now, in advance of the Cancun Framework Convention meeting, I'll just say a couple more things and we'll stop. We produced a report with the Alliance for Climate Protection along with Climate Advisors, and which is a consulting firm here in Washington led by Nigel Purvis that some of you may know, as well as Project Catalyst. We produced a report that really looked at this gap, right? This gap between here and here and here and here, and how much, where would you actually need the reductions, right? Where would you need the reductions in 3 sectors: in efficiency, in renewables, and in land use change? Where could we actually see? Because we know what the reductions that parties plan, because they're all in their pledges in Copenhagen, but we don't know what sectors of the global emissions pool we could get reductions to get from here to here by 2020. So we broke all that down, and we also came up with a price tag for all that, and that was the point of this report. And I encourage you to look at the report, and you can sort of we gave it this title: "The U.S. Role in International Climate Finance," optimistically at the time. But now we might title it, I think, some other way, and sort of who's going to sort of lead the effort in order to get this. But nonetheless, you can actually break these numbers down into a fairly refined set of scenarios which are achievable. So this 4 gigaton gap that we need to overcome by 2020, we can break it down. Again, like I said, in terms of installed power capacity, energy efficiency, and the forestry sector, where we need to be in order to go from the low Copenhagen scenarios to the high scenarios to the 450 parts per million path. You can come up with a price tag for how much all this is going to cost, taking into account the self-finance projects that already parties are putting into. So, for example, the Climate Policy Institute did a rate report on the current state of international climate finance and found that if you count self-finance projects in developing countries, some $97 billion was spent in 2010 alone in 1 year on mitigation and adaptation. Only, unfortunately, $4 billion for adaptation, and I think this is something we'll come back to given Peter's presentation. But there actually is quite a lot of self-finance activity out there, and the amount that actually you would need in order to close these gaps actually is not $100 billion every year between now and 2020. The first, in fact, installment you need out until 2015 is only about $30 billion a year. And given that the international community is now doing $10 billion a year, right, in what's called fast start mitigation, I think it's certainly plausible we could increase that ambition by 2015 and then move forward through the rest of the decade. And then you can break this down even further. Of course, the problem with climate finance is not just the sources of the finance, but also the absorption capacity of countries to turn the money into projects. And the world is a big place with very, very different kinds of economic conditions. So we don't want the same problem globally that the United States faced with respect to its stimulus funding, where we had a lot of stimulus funding for a lot of projects and we couldn't get the money out the door fast enough in the amount we had to spend it. So in the report, we break this down to developed capital markets, developing capital markets, and no capital markets in different places, and on and on and on. Like, I won't go through this in any detail, but you can sort of see that you can actually break this down and find a feasible pathway to getting there. And that, I think, should be what we focus on moving forward, perhaps more than pointing fingers over who did or who didn't get the most we could have out of Kyoto. So thank you.
Great, thank you all. I can see dozens of interesting ways this discussion could go, and that's going to be left to you in the audience to direct that. But I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and just make something that's sort of a cross between a comment and a question. When I was listening to this, when I was thinking about preparing for this, I was thinking about the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the whole notion of addicts and suppliers pointing fingers at each other. And, I see somewhat of that in the Canadian-U.S. relationship on this, too. But one interesting thing you never mentioned, and I don't know whether it's come into your analysis yet, and by the way, the huge receipts, that very big number, I can see where the temptations are. But you didn't mention the potential for the Arctic opening up and what that might do for Canada. And I just wondered whether that's figured at all in your calculations and whether people are starting to talk about that.
People are starting to talk about it. There's two different costs, if you will. There's the cost of mitigation, the cost of adaptation, as Peter mentioned. So what this conversation mostly about in Kyoto was the cost of achieving targets, the cost of doing something. And those numbers became, for many people, fairly prohibitive. We've done some research that shows that, in fact, you can do. It wasn't Kyoto. We looked at getting to various 2020 targets, and pointed to a technology pathway. We looked at economy-wide carbon pricing, and found ways to do that that were that didn't really dampen economic growth in any meaningful way. And we looked at regional and sectoral impacts. I mean, countries can do that. They just have to sort of shift some of their, some of the path dependency approaches they're on with their energy economy. But in the case of the Arctic, it's a question of how fast and to what extent the sea ice melts, and to what extent it opens up possibilities for, say, resource exploitation or navigation, traffic, and to what extent it also impinges on indigenous communities and other things that requires kinds of measures to address that. And there hasn't, to my knowledge, there hasn't been sort of a singular study that kind of goes at that and pulls those things together in the way you're getting at, Ruth. I think we've done some work looking at impacts on infrastructure, degrading permafrost. I mean, you're going to have to put some more money into shoring up infrastructure. It's not just public infrastructure, and that it's private. It's cell phone towers, tailings ponds, and other things. I mean, there are lots of kinds of cascade effects that we're just starting to all comprehend when you look at this kind of pervasive and pernicious nature of climate change. So work the Roundtable has done. We've actually put a price on what are the overall national economic impacts of climate change, looking at various scenarios. And there are different probabilities, and that there's tons of uncertainty, right? So take all that into account. But the modeling that we did, which was the first ever conducted at a national level in Canada, found that in 2050, sort of an expected basic path that kind of mirrors 2 degrees. Getting to that, it's not exactly, assuming that we would be there, was about $40 billion a year in 2050. And if you have a different path of lower emissions overall globally, and this is the cost of global emissions to Canada, because we're only 2%. Right? I mean, it's not what Canada's emissions will do to Canada, it's what the world will do to Canada, if you will. And we use that as a way to say, look, adaptation needs to be on the agenda. There's an economic cost and impact on climate change, and this was global, across the country. We looked at some individual impacts of coastal regions, the forestry sector, and human health. We looked at mortality, morbidity rates in key major Canadian cities. Just to try to show the different kinds of impacts, but nobody has really done it yet on the Arctic. And there's costs of impacts, there's cost opportunities. So it's this is the nature of climate change. It's not a one-dimensional sort of one thing happening only. It's a very complicated that, and depending how you look at it, you can see different facets to it.
Interesting. Why don't we open it up? I think there's a microphone that's going to be passed around. Thanks.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm a senior associate at CSIS and a longtime analyst of energy and environmental policy in North America, as well as within the three countries that make up North America. I'd like to go back to the title of the conference after saying thank you for a very stimulating presentation. So Canada left Kyoto. Why? And what's next? Now, David McLaughlin offered at the end of his presentation a multiple choice of answers and as to why Canada left, and said he would leave the answers to the audience and the panel. So I'd like to ask the panel if it would be helpful if you could get back to that slide to give your reactions to those. Personally, I think the best answer is probably all of the above. Secondly,
it was a trick question, Joe. That was the answer.
Well, I'd still like to get a chance to write them all down. You only showed it for an instant. Secondly, I think that you promised some insights into the Roundtable's analysis on this round to date, and perhaps without any guarantee what its advice to the Canadian government might be, even though you pointed out the government doesn't have to accept the advice. But I admire the work of the Roundtable, and I'd be very interested in your progress toward your next report.
Thank you, Joe. Happy to give you a flavor for it. We were asked by the minister directly. It's called a ministerial reference, so it tends to get our attention. How can the government achieve its 2020 target? Where are we with provincial territorial climate change plans? And really, what kind of progress are we making within the context of the federal approach, which is a sector-by-sector regulatory approach? And so we've been given a certain set of parameters, but that's the policy approach we're going on. And interestingly, we're delighted to get this work because, interestingly, nobody had really surprisingly perhaps, had kind of looked at the Federation in that sense that, okay, how do these things kind of all add up, and what can we reasonably expect? When the Minister of Environment goes to represent Canada at an event, represent Canada as a whole, but provinces tend to attend these things, right? They go along and they talk about what they're doing. And so in certain respects, it is an aggregate. It is a leveling up of all of these various initiatives. But the Federal Minister of Environment can't determine what the Minister of Environment in Ontario does. But it's just the nature of the beast. So Canada to date has not had a lot of sort of formal engagement at an intergovernmental level in terms of saying, okay, let's get a pan-Canadian policy. There's been some obviously dialogue leading to international meetings, and there's a lot of technical work going on, which is good, and the data is sophisticated, it's complete in many ways, and they're sharing inventory pieces and that. But there hasn't been that kind of policy integration. So a starting point has to be, where are we? How are we doing? And so we were asked to do that. I've really just given you a very modest sort of snippet of it, in part because we have to give it to the minister first. But I'm whetting the appetite a bit out there. And we're finding so we've looked at every provincial plan. We've modeled all the things that are, if I can use this word, modelable. There's some things that provinces, governments put up and say this will get you a certain emission reduction. Nobody knows. It's their voluntary behavioral things. There's no way to really say. But we believe our numbers will be the reality check and say this is where the country is really at. And so I gave you a little flavor to say we're in fact making some progress. We've modeled more policies than say, federal government has done. These will be new numbers. But what we've also done is taken a bit what Andrew has mentioned. We've looked at how do you fill the gap. There is a gap. There will be a gap in 2020 on the basis of policies out there that we know that are in place and also are likely to be put into effect. Even if the targets are met? Well, no, this is the gap to the 2020 target. Right now, we would not be able to say that we are exactly on the path to achieve the 2020 target on the basis of policies that are currently out there. That doesn't mean governments won't put into place other policies, and the federal government is moving on some other areas they've talked about, but we don't have all the details. They're consulting, such as oil and gas, again, the sector-by-sector stuff. So we don't know yet whether they will actually add up, but on the basis of what we've seen, there is a gap. So how do you close that gap? Some of the work that we will show is I talked about costs and high costs of cost of abatement. We've looked at cost effectiveness of all the measures. I said Andrew's looking at, is there a pathway to 2020 globally? We're looking at a pathway to 2020 nationally, and we will show where those emission reductions can come from, which sector, which province, and what might the cost be. And the reality is, the longer you wait to achieve an emission reduction target, assuming you're going down that path, and this applies to any jurisdiction, the higher the price you'll pay, because you're trying to do an awful lot real fast. That was the Kyoto dilemma. That would have been, say, the turning the corner dilemma. It may be the 2020 dilemma for Canada if we didn't make some progress. So it's important to benchmark where you are, and important to benchmark whether you've got things in place to kind of get you to the next step. So that's the work that we're doing. My sense will be that it'll set the standard for where the country is really at and what we can reasonably expect to get there. And the advice that I think we'll see, it's the roundtable that has to make this determination. We're not there yet. We haven't finished our process. But I think we'll give some useful advice and realistic advice as to what the country should do to perhaps change some of the dialogue, some of the way that we're engaging on it, and get governments perhaps a little bit more integrated getting there, and saying, we've got to do things in some cases a little bit differently. In other cases, this is working. It's it's nuanced. It's not going to be it's not a bumper sticker kind of story here, and that's what I guess I was trying to show, that there's a range of factors. There's a number of things at play. A little longer answer, perhaps, what you're looking for, but just gives you a bit of the flavor for it.
Well, I can comment briefly. I think the first time I ever spoke at this center actually was 2007, and we had a conference on Kyoto and where Canada was going. Stacey Van der Veer put it together, and my initial comment was, while we're still waiting for the death bell, the Conservatives are certainly planning the funeral arrangements for Kyoto. And I think that given what, and I don't want to start laying blame, I think we should be looking forward here. But it is a situation where it hasn't been taken perhaps with the sort of long-term seriousness that we need to deal with this issue, and this precedes the Conservatives as well. It was always a difficult thing to go from ratification to implementation, as you know, given the differences between provinces and so forth, and the complex political milieu of Canada. So, in a sense, I see what's happened recently as fairly inevitable, perhaps lamentable, but again, I do applaud the policy honesty in this, and to at least come out and say, okay, we're not going to make it. The question is it still important to try to get back on track and try and look towards these, the 2020 targets that Andrew's talked about and so on. And there, I think the jury's still out there. We'll have to see, what the next moves are. But I guess the short answer then is all of the above. But I especially like the fact that you included in that list the lack of a plan, which is just, it's a fact of political life, but it's not necessarily inevitable that we can't think longer term. And it's things like the roundtable that can help formulate that.
So I'll just say two things quickly in terms of moving forward. One is very concrete and one kind of speculative. And the concrete one that I'll say is that in terms of activity outside the UN process, the biggest, most important mitigation effort we could make throughout the rest of this decade would be on non-CO2 emissions. So short-lived climate, what are called short-lived climate forcers. And in that respect, I applaud my government and the Canadian government, as well as Mexico, Sweden, Ghana, and Bangladesh, which just last month announced the new Climate and Clean Air Coalition on Short-Lived Climate Pollutants. And the idea there is to create a, sort of coalition of the willing, I guess I shouldn't use that term, but effectively what it is, of parties who are willing to put some money down and really step up efforts to go specifically after HFCs, methane, and black carbon. And the potential here is enormous in order to buy us some time, and also to avoid an incredible problem that we'd have in the future, even on the best case scenarios on reducing carbon emissions. So what we're talking about are three pollutants which shorter lived than carbon. Carbon, about half of all carbon emissions last anywhere from around 150 to 150 years in the atmosphere, continue to have warming potential. Some small, 20% of carbon will persist in the atmosphere thousands to tens of thousands of years. And so the emissions reductions we achieve now really don't affect the temperature till well into the future on carbon. On things like methane and HFCs and black carbon is soot from diesel, from cook stoves, from other things like this, you actually have pollutants which are have much more global warming potential than CO2, but they last relatively short. So methane is a good example, which has 70% more force than CO2 over a 20-year period, but only persists in the atmosphere, around 15 years for every particular molecule that's emitted. And so, if we effectively, here's the numbers on this are incredibly impressive, and there was a wonderful article from an international team of scientists organized by NASA that came out in Science in January on this. If you just took on, put aside HFCs, just took on methane and black carbon and took about 12 fairly low-hanging fruit initiatives to reduce those gases, you could lower the temperature of the planet 1 degree by 2030. Now that's pretty important when your target is to hold at 2 degrees Celsius. You don't lock in that 1 degree unless you also get reductions in CO2, but you also can't hold on to the temperature decrease you'd eventually get from CO2 unless you also get rid of these short-lived forcers as well, right? So that's a problem you absolutely have to confront at some point. Better to do it now when the relative amounts of these short-lived forcers in the atmosphere are lower, whereas they're really going to take off. So HFCs, are a problem now, but they'll be a much bigger problem by 2030. And also, in terms of the other ways of measuring success here, you also, according to the Drew Shindell paper that was published in Science, could avoid around 4 million deaths annually by 2030 if you just take on the black carbon and HFCs, and also increase crop yields by hundreds of thousands of tons. So this is really important, this announcement of this coalition. And we can do things like, for example, use the Montreal Protocol to take on HFCs, which Canada, the US, and Mexico have pushed through in the last 3 years, a North American proposal to get eventual phase out of HFCs. The other thing, and this is I'd sort of say that, the US and Canada have multiple problems in the international process in terms of their perception. They're different problems, right? The US being a very big emitter, relatively speaking, in the world, biggest historical emitter, second biggest total emitter now, and then we've pulled out. We look a little bit better, I guess, standing next to the Canadians insofar as we never promised to be part of Kyoto, so we didn't renege on it, right? So there's none of that sort of backing out problem. But I think that here, I mean, the Canadians, this is not the kind of advice that David would take forward to the Prime Minister. It wouldn't be the kind of thing that would be called for by his organization. But I do think that the sort of the best global model for Canada that I would see would be Norway. So a relatively small population, but a big exporter, right, of carbon emitting fuels. And the way the Norwegians have done this, and of course they're relatively wealthier, so it's easier obviously for them to do this, but nonetheless was to go really double down on climate finance, and double down on exporting climate expertise around the world. And so even though Norway's still making billions of dollars off of their oil exports, they nonetheless are taking leadership in terms of reducing emissions in developing countries and tropical forestry, way more than what their expected share should be. I would say 1.2 billion is pretty good, given the way we measure what any country's contribution should be towards climate finance. If Canadians increase that and said, we're doing this partly because, look, we're not in a position where we can avoid of exporting our products, but we can use some proceeds of this to help to pay for mitigation efforts in other countries. In fact, the government of Alberta has actually tried to do something like this. So I think that is probably the advice that I would give in terms of how Canada could show international leadership.
Let's go back to the audience, but I just would recommend that on the Norway issue, people read a book called Living in Denial, which is an interesting examination of Norway's psyche on these issues. Please.
Good morning. My name's Mary Ann Rood. I'm the province of Manitoba's representative here in Washington. And I'm wondering, this might be a question more for David, I'm not sure. I'm wondering how other initiatives like the Winnipeg Consensus and Premier Redford's efforts for a Canadian energy strategy play into everything you've been talking about today, if you could elaborate.
We're part of the Winnipeg Consensus Group, as you know, Marianne. The Roundtable, one of a number of think tanks that have came together to try to talk about this and create some policy space for the country, not to overstate our importance, but perhaps for the political class to address the energy issue from a pan-Canadian perspective. Canada's history on this, for anybody knows, is you just put the words national and energy together and you get National Energy Program, and you get a whole bunch of angst in the country. We've also been looking for new vocabulary. Anyways, a bunch of think tanks got together a couple of years ago to start a process and say, could we bring industry, governments together and think about how do we get at energy and climate because of the relationship, get at these issues together. And the view on it was that, and we've done this, and we've convened and we've had several meetings. The last one was in Halifax, so in Atlantic Canada, just about 3 weeks ago. We've created some space. The energy ministers, federally, provincially, have taken on some of the Winnipeg Consensus Group sort of admonitions to think about a pan-Canadian framework. It's gotten some good editorial comments. So I'll say the political class is more aware of it. The intellectual class, the people, they're talking a bit more about it, and that was really getting to first base. It was just opening up some space on it. Two other elements of it. One is that to get at climate issues, there was a view that maybe we had to go through the energy door. Maybe not exclusively, but energy, instead of going through the climate door and say energy, you have to adapt and adjust this way, looking at the energy realities and building in climate concerns, environmental concerns, might have led to some or lead to some better outcomes. So it's shifting the tone a bit and getting some people involved too, and seeing it perhaps a bit more positively. Yes, we can do something about this than they had been before. And again, I think we've seen some success on that. And the other part was bringing Western Canada into it. So the political economy issue as to where most of the energy exporting wealth comes from. The strong political base for the current government, and also because of the mentioned the provincial ownership of natural resources. So all of these things came together, and we now have a new premier in Alberta. The election coming up, so we'll see. But Premier Redford has certainly taken this on, and it's talking about the need for Canadian energy framework and strategy. And so, all in all, we're not seeing yet demonstrable policy changes or outcomes, but we are seeing a shift in tone. And I think anybody who watches and knows about the linkage about politics and policy knows that you've got to shift the tone if you want to make these kinds of bigger policy shifts over time. So, not to overstate, not to think that or oversell what could be there, but there is a beginning of a better conversation in the country. And in my view, whether it's on this or any other thing, it never hurts for Canadians to talk to each other. I have a lot of background in intergovernmental affairs, so I never met a meeting I didn't like. So we do that. But there's been a lot of angst and acrimony, and on some issues, including energy, and so you got to find the right way to do it. Manitoba has been a big player and an important player in it. Premier Selinger has lent his good offices to it, which I think is very important. And the fact that we met in Winnipeg, not to overstate, again, the center of the country and geographically in many ways, it was important. It also came from Manitoba, which is often seen as a bridge in between East and West. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So we're making some progress, and Premier Dexter, the last thing I'll say on it, Premier Dexter spoke at the meeting of the Winnipeg Consensus Group at dinner about 3 weeks ago, and he said he was going to put this issue on the agenda of the Council of the Federation meeting in August, September, which he is hosting. So we're getting a bit more traction on it. I think it can play positively into the climate conversation because it just gets people talking about these things. Energy ministers are not environment ministers, and they're still silos, and and this is a horizontal integrated issue, but it is a doorway, and I think we have to pursue any number of angles to try to make the progress. So it's I'm upbeat, but realistic about what this is.
Were there more? I saw a hand over. Oh, sorry, Larry. You want to? Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm Larry Heilman. I'm with the Anthropology Department across the street in the Natural History Museum. And I've been looking at technical assistance transfers north to south in the hemisphere. I essentially am concerned with these issues from a hemispheric, Western hemispheric vantage point. And if you look at how far we've come in terms of looking at the Western hemisphere, certainly we've made a lot of progress since the 30s when we used to refer to Canada as the forgotten country. And then as we went into the 70s with a really important book by Pearson talking about North-South dialogue, again, we see tremendous progress. What I've learned more recently, just coming to seminars here at the Woodrow Wilson, is that the whole sort of economic reference in terms of the Western Hemisphere has changed dramatically, with most of the countries in South America achieving middle income status. So my question really is, how do we look at the problem from a Western Hemisphere standpoint in terms of transfers, and realizing that most of your South American countries really, don't need more resource transfers. What they need is looking how they can address these problems themselves, how they can make more contributions beyond the hemisphere, and how we can work as a Western Hemisphere in addressing these issues. You give some allusions to it, but I think this whole concept of what we do in terms of the Western Hemisphere addressing this critical issue needs to be strengthened because a lot to be offered and a lot to be gained by addressing these basic issues pretty much with their own resources.
I'll just start, well,
Yeah.
my colleagues should come in on this, but two things from the Canadian context, and perhaps world to a degree as well. We're in a period of fiscal consolidation here. The economy, global economy, is not yet on the on a positive growth track that we had seen in the past. We're getting mixed signals in some respects. Governments in many jurisdictions are looking to address deficit and debt issues. So the ability to finance more, when you in democracies where you have taxpayers saying, raising a question, wait a minute, I still have my services and our tax rates, et cetera, I think is going to be fairly limited in the next little while. So in terms of financial transfers increasing on files that are not more directly related to people's lives and the current economic financial situation, I think it's going to be tougher to do a lot more than what we've seen, at least in the next little while. The second part of it is the accountability piece that was mentioned. I mean, if there is going to be this stuff, then there's going to be more demands for at least I think from a Canadian perspective, and I think it's fine, and perhaps other countries. Where's the money going? What's it being used for? And in that context, if it's part of international agreements, I mean, some of the tie-in on green financing and other stuff that the Canadian government is talking about is, okay, when you have a binding agreement, when you have everybody in, when it's whatever kind of architectural issues they put on to say it's, we're just not going to fund things for the sake of funding, or, it's not just a reputational thing. Like, we want something that works. And, I'll let others decide, how objective or whatever that is, but just take the words or take it at its face value. That would suggest that aspirational funding and to do these things and do more will be harder to get in the climate context unless we are on some kind of appropriate global path. So there's a bunch of things that on the outside that are going to make it, I think, more complicated, difficult to make the kind of progress that somebody might want. Just an observation, and no empirical evidence, but there you are.
Yeah, so I'll answer your question, but I first want to respond just a bit to David. I don't disagree with what he said, but I think it's kind of interesting here if you look at this. Why is it that we've been able to set 2 ambitious targets on climate finance in the last 3 years, but we haven't been able to set any more additional targets on mitigation, right? And I think, and the 2 ambitious targets are, first of all, the Fast Start goal, $30 billion, mostly and essentially ODA from developed to developing countries from 2010 to 2012, and now the $100 billion by 2020 goal, along with the new architecture for the Green Climate Fund. And I think the reason is because that that everyone who looks at those commitments, especially the second commitment, sees that really there is very little expectation that this is going to come from public money, and even that the public money that is used, the majority of it's going to come from public money, but the public money that is used is most likely going to come from some cooperative financing scheme rather than unitary contributions, right? So no serious analyst of climate finance thinks that you get $100 billion a year by 2050 unless a big portion of that's from private finance. And so that gives people say, okay, well, as long as we accept that, and that has now completely been made kosher, right, through the architecture of the Green Climate Fund language that made it through Durban, then I think that sort of eases off, part of the worry there, right? Raises a problem for adaptation because it's harder to privately finance adaptation, but there's very interesting work I would recommend. There's a wonderful paper the Stockholm Environment Institute has put out on adaptation markets, which is really just absolutely fascinating reading about the possibilities there if you could do it in a fair way. Secondly, the cooperative schemes. So I would sort of say that before we get any big jump up in commitments from any parties of what they're willing to do in terms of international climate finance now, what will first be done is we try to get, say, an international tax on shipping fuels, or an international tax on, or some kind of price on carbon for aviation fuels. And there are forcing mechanisms that are going to pull that along whether or not parties want to. And the most important of these, if you follow these issues closely, is of course the decision by the European Union that all flights going in and out of Europe, anyone using European airports now has to pay into the entire life cycle of your flight, not just the part of the flight over Europe, has to pay into all the life cycle of the carbon life cycle of your flight has to be accounted for under the European trading system, and that'll slightly increase the cost of tickets. We just published a report, that's aggregated all the studies, over 30 of them, on what the price of this. It will be negligible. Many airlines are going to make money in the short term on this. There's a huge diplomatic fight about this that the U.S. is sort of helping to lead against the ETS. But I think that my kind of view on this is that at the end of the day, Europe will get away with doing this unless U.S. airlines want to give up on using European airports, which is, I think, not terribly likely. So things like that are going to pull probably towards, because Europe has done this, we're more likely to get an agreement in the International Civil Aviation Organization for a global airline deal on emissions, which potentially could create a source of financing for climate. So I think that will pull things along. On North-South in the Western Hemisphere, I totally agree with you about the potential. Mexico has shown amazing leadership on this. The Green Climate Fund is an idea that President Calderon advanced at the Major Economies Forum in Paris in the spring of 2009, and he has made this a legacy issue in terms of his administration. And what we have seen in terms of the sophistication, and this goes to the accountability issue that David was talking about, the Latin American countries have the most sophisticated, what are called nationally appropriate mitigation action plans that they have put forward to show, if you give us money, here's what we'll spend it on, and here's how we will prove accountability and prove that we actually will get the reductions that we promised to get. And if you want the best work in D.C. that's been done on this is at the Center for Clean Air Policy, led by Ned Helm, where he's help a bunch of the Latin American countries to put forward these national plans for how they would spend additional climate finance. So I think that there is actually a lot of potential there for the North American-South American relationship.
Okay. No, that's fine.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everyone for a really interesting and rich discussion and for some great questions from the audience. And I'm sure this is a to be continued, as these problems are not going away. And I would not be surprised if I saw the same people here again very soon to talk about the same issues. So thank you very much, all of you. And great.
Thank you.